Australian True Crime Cases Part 3. On February 16th of 1984, a storm was brewing in the village of Narooma, about 150 kilometres south of Sydney. A family of 4 would go through their usual nightly routine before heading to bed, and in one room, Morna and her boyfriend Neil, and in the other, Morna's 2 children, Bradley and Renee. 3 years apart, Bradley being 8 years older than Renee, who was only 5 years old at the time. At about 4:45, Bradley would wake up from the cold, but found that strangely, his blanket was pushed all the way down past his knees. A sort of sibling ritual that would happen when one of the pair was scared or couldn't sleep. Bradley did what he would normally do in that situation, crawl into his sister's bed. But upon climbing into the sheets, he found that the bed was empty, with his 5-year-old sister Renee nowhere to be found. Bradley sheepishly got out of bed and investigated, wondering where she could be. And at first, he didn't want to wake his mother Morna, so he did search around the house, even checking the fridge. Bradley would turn around to find the back door was wide open. In a panic, he would rush to his mother's side and shake her awake. When awoken, Morna went into her children's room to find that Renee was not in her bed, and after a search of the Aitken property, she would find that Renee was nowhere to be found. Morna's boyfriend at the time, Neil, rushed to the car to do a street search. Perhaps Renee wandered out during the storm, or even worse, perhaps someone had found the unlocked door, which was something that was common at the time, and took her. After driving around and finding nothing but darkness, Morna contacted the police. New South Wales police theorised that Renee had been taken between the hours of 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. that night, a wide window of opportunity. Because the storms persisted for the following 3 days, police weren't able to search. So when better weather arrived, an extensive search took place with more than 200 police personnel and tracker dogs, along with local volunteers searching in a single line through the bushland, while sky and water search teams covered the coastline. Rivers and lakes in surrounding areas were dragged to no avail, and 2 months later, reports of a strange smell in an area about 20 k's south of Narooma would spark a renewed interest in the investigation, but after no findings, the search ran cold. Another 2 months would go by before authorities would search the swampland near the Aitken home. This area had previously been searched, and in both searches, nothing ever came of it. Police received a tip that Renee had been murdered not long after she was taken, and that they would find her in the bushland that was near the Aitken home. She was never found, and there is no information about where that tip even came from. Standing in opposition to that tip, there have been unconfirmed sightings of Renee, one on the Gold Coast 3 days after the disappearance, where a witness claimed that they saw her with 2 men in Tugun, and another sighting where a witness claimed that they saw her with a man about 75 kilometres from the family home. In Narooma, in January of the next year, a 50-year-old woman would be fishing in a small boat. She found a leg bone, but in shock threw it back into the lake and then called police. The bone was found, but it was later found to be that of an animal bone. The case would go cold for another 4 years before a human jawbone with 2 small teeth was found in Sydney's northern peninsula. The bones were found to be that of a child, about 5 to 6 years old. And according to the True Crime Diva, the teeth showed signs that they were treated with fluoride. As there was only one missing girl in that age group at the time, the thought was that it could be her. But as nothing has ever been confirmed, it kind of seems irrelevant to the case now. There were rumours early on that Morna and Neil could be involved in the disappearance of their daughter, but those allegations were very quickly ruled out by police. And in the early 2000s, an American woman would contact police claiming that she could be Renee. She had been adopted and was searching Australian missing children when she came across a photo of Renee. The woman would later travel to Australia to have her DNA compared to Morna. Unfortunately though, there was no match, and the Aitken family spoke of how difficult it was to protect Morna from things like this, these moments of false hope. Mourner's DNA would later be compared to 440 unidentified remains using familial DNA. Police did have one prime suspect for the kidnapping, and it was a man who had served a 5-year prison sentence for indecent assault of children. Police interviewed a man named Brian Fitzpatrick in relation to Renee Aitken's abduction, and although he denies any involvement, is unable to provide an alibi for the window of opportunity, and police left the interview convinced that he was involved, according to the Australian Missing Persons Registrar. Brian mentioned that on the night Renee disappeared, he had driven past the Aitken family home 3 times. Brian refused to be re-interviewed by police following the reopening of Renee's case in 1998. Brian would later be named in an inquest that would take place in 2003, where the coroner returned a verdict that the 5-year-old was likely killed shortly after being abducted. Brian did know the Aitken family after meeting Renee's aunt, Bonnie Atkins, through her boyfriend at the time. And at the time of the abduction, Renee's aunt Bonnie and her boyfriend and Brian were on a fishing trip near the family home. Bonnie says that she does feel responsible for introducing Brian to the family at the time. She was using drugs and she knew that Brian was a cold and callous man. And on the night of Renee's abduction, Brian would visit the Aitken home to collect some blankets. He would later tell police that after he collected the blankets, that he drove around for several hours and go to the beach for a swim and to listen to music. But Renee's aunt would counter this claim by saying that Brian didn't swim. The whole time they were on the trip, even while the rest of them were swimming, he never swam once. Mourner reported that Brian had come back to the family home after Renee was reported missing to look for the blanket, but he'd already collected it from the previous visit. And she said that he was the creepiest person and did look drug affected. Neil, Mourner's boyfriend at the time, would mention in an interview with police that he remembered that Brian showed up the morning Renee was kidnapped. He said that there was one thing that he remembers from that encounter with Brian, that it was a cool morning, about 5 or 6 a.m, and he was sweating. A family friend of the Aitken family, who was convinced that Brian was involved, pursued him and reported that when they confronted Brian, he replied with a smile and said, "They'll never prove it." This has been taken by the family as an admission of guilt, and according to the Australian Missing Persons Register, Brian had previously been convicted of sex crimes against Renee's 12-year-old cousin just 3 weeks after Renee went missing. Brian would pass away after running his car into a pole, with police naming it a suicide. However, his wife denies that Brian would purposely take his own life. This happened weeks before he was supposed to appear in court for Renee's inquest, and it left the Aitken family feeling like their last chance for resolve was snatched away. In 2013, police turned their attention away from Brian, who had died 10 years earlier, and began to suspect a man named Michael Guider, who had been previously convicted for horrific crimes against Samantha Knight 2 years after Renee was abducted. Samantha's remains were also never found, and Michael did claim that he forgot where he had placed them. A man named Witness O would come forward with information against Michael, claiming that Michael would often talk about a girl named Renee, even sketching a picture of what she looked like, which bears striking similarities to Renee. Witness O was a former cellmate of Michael Guider. The drawing would later be handed in to police by a 58-year-old woman named Miss Hoffman, who frequently received poems, letters, and drawings from Michael in the mid-90s. Michael Guider kept newspaper clippings about Renee's abduction, and Miss Hoffman, who was a mother of 5, would turn Michael in and go undercover for police to secure evidence against him in the Samantha Knight case. Michael was released in 2019, and police do not believe that Michael was involved and still maintain that Brian is the prime suspect in Renee's disappearance. Bradley would go on to name his daughter Renee. One morning, he would walk into his daughter chewing on ice from a cup, which is something that his sister would frequently do. How on earth did she learn that, he marveled. Bradley says that his daughter picked up a habit from his sister without even meeting her, and that naming his daughter Renee is to honor his sister and not to replace her. Renee has a memorial site in the headland of Narooma, which reads, "In loving memory of our shining little star, Renee Joy Aitken." This case has been covered extensively in the media and has had countless hours of investigation, many leads and many volunteers, and continued interest over the decades since Renee disappeared. disappeared. This is definitely one of those cases where police put their heart and soul into it, and the public has continued to pour effort into solving this case. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next Sunday for more true crime.